our Shadow Secretary of State for Housing since April of this year, really hit the ground running, and I think also a great supporter of the work that we've been doing with Labour Housing Group. So I'm really delighted to welcome Thangam Debonnaire MP to speak to us this morning. So over to you, Thangam.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Sheila, for organising us, and especially me, because Sheila is, I don't know if the same goes for everyone, but she's certainly very patient with me when it comes to the tech. I don't have my headset today, so I'm really hoping that the audio is okay. Do start waving at me if my sound starts to drift. I got a thumbs up there from Amanda, so I'm taking that as a testimonial that I'm all right. So I want to thank also the very many people on this call who've been so generous with me and my small team, sharing your expertise, your knowledge and your experience. I'm also incredibly grateful to my predecessor, John Healy. It's hard to follow someone as well-respected, knowledgeable and experienced as John, but he's been so kind and thoughtful in handing over to me in a really productive way. But also my Shadow Minister, Mike Amesbury, and my whip, who some of you may know if you've worked in London housing, that is James, and I'm having a middle-age moment and I just suddenly can't remember his second name, who was Deputy Mayor for London and for housing, and he's on with you later. And I've also got some fantastic support from the rest of the MHCLG team with Shadow Secretary Steve Reid. So I'm keen to get in as much discussion and questions and contributions as we can. So I'm going to pose some questions and then I'm hoping that might stimulate some engagement. The COVID crisis, goodness, don't we wish that we didn't have to start every speech with this, but we are in a very difficult time, I think, for our country, for the world. And it has revealed, as I think everyone on this call will know, the consequences of poor quality housing. Too many people living in damp, dark, poorly designed and poorly insulated accommodation, and the lockdown really highlighted the consequences of this. The government's planning reforms, as many of you will know, will only make this situation worse. And the Tories' solution to our housing crisis is to remove powers from elected local representatives like John and others on this call and hand them to Whitehall appointed boards of developers while doing nothing to solve the growing affordable housing crisis our country faces. Now, we've all seen what happens when the Secretary of State for Housing, Robert Jenrick, takes planning decisions into his control. And affordable housing and community infrastructure does not benefit when that happens. The best predictor of future behaviour being past behaviour, I would say that tells us nothing good about the government's commitments to what we in our community need. So last week we had a debate in Parliament led by my colleague, the wonderful Mike Amesbury, on the government's disastrous permitted development proposals. As many of you will know, permitted development already results in swathes of poor quality housing in towns and cities. But the changes will result in even more, with empty shops being turned into housing rather than government supporting those spaces on our high streets being brought back into some form of retail use. Now, we won a last-minute concession from the government. They conceded that permitted development homes should be required to meet base standards. Well, how generous. I don't think I need to thank them for that. They shouldn't have been doing the opposite in the first place. But that doesn't address the multitude of other quality issues with permitted development. The family's experience of the COVID crisis has been determined in large part by whether or not they've got access to a garden or even a balcony, whether they live near a park or a playground. As far as I can see, the government's U-turn doesn't address any of those. Of course, permitted development will still be allowed to bypass requirements around affordable housing and local infrastructure and also our environmental standards. It's just a prelude to a much more wide-ranging and damaging assault on our planning system. And this poses a lot of challenges for us as a Labour Party and the Socialists, which is how we're going to construct a better housing system in 4 years' time on the back of damage that is yet to be committed by this government. So we have to challenge them and try and obtain more U-turns along the way. But I'm not going to pretend that's going to be easy with an 80-strong majority that the Tory government has. And they appear to be ignoring the vast majority of the recommendations of the Affordable Housing Commission, for instance. This offers a sound, well-thought-through route to addressing the shortfall of 4.75 million homes built across council, housing association, owner-occupied and private rented sectors, so across tenure. But affordable isn't just about rent or mortgage, as the Affordable Housing Commission describes well. It's also about quality, so that homes are affordable to heat and run, as well as the basic rent and mortgage. So permitted development ignoring those things just makes for greater expense in any case. So one of my first questions then, as we move through and hopefully eventually out of the COVID crisis sooner rather than later, how do we as socialists, how do we plan for the comfortable, beautiful, affordable homes in this new world? Because the government's using that language but I don't see that commitment seen through on their actual proposal. That's question one. How do we do that? Big question. We're going to do that in a lot of workshops today, I know. At the moment, some of our country's least affordable, least beautiful, and least comfortable homes are in the private rented sector, poorly regulated sector, and the evictions crisis has revealed issues that have been long underlying. It's scandalous, in my view, and I've said so in the chamber, that the Tories have lifted the ban as coronavirus cases are rising and we head towards a second spike of infections, particularly as this is a respiratory illness. And many people who are left in private rented accommodation will spend the winter in homes that are hard to heat, are damp, and are drafty. But those that do lose their homes will be probably placed into emergency accommodation, but some of them will end up on the streets. And that's a terrible decision to have taken without a proper plan. Because the government actually said back in March, and I quote, and I'm sure I've said this to many of the people on this call before, the government said no renter will lose their home because of coronavirus. So we've been calling on them for months to come forward with a credible plan to ensure that no one loses their home. And we did manage to squeeze concessions out of them in the extensions to the ban, but it wasn't enough without a proper plan for how to help tenants. We've got plenty of suggestions as well. The government can't say they didn't have ideas given to them, well thought through ideas from us, from Shelter, from Citizens Advice, from Generation Rent, and from Labour campaigners on this call and across the country. But instead, the government's chosen to withdraw the protection of the eviction ban just at the moment when it's they've delayed indefinitely, it seems to me, their promise to end Section 21 evictions, the so-called no-fault evictions from private rented. And added to this, the end of the repossessions ban for owner-occupiers is now looming at the end of this month. So my second question, the first one was about quality, but the second question is how do we assure that nobody, no matter what sector of the housing market they're in, has security? So quality and security. And then finally, the third set of questions I want to pose about climate, because if we're thinking about any proposals for 2024, climate has to be integrated into our thinking, not an add-on. As a member of the Shadow Cabinet's Climate Action Subcommittee, this is a big part of my work, because too much of our existing housing is not climate change proof. It's cold in winter, it's hot in summer, it's poorly insulated and poorly ventilated. We've got too many homes on flood zones without any adequate preparation for what's ahead. This has got consequences for our carbon emissions, as well as for fuel poverty and health. And as I said, in a pandemic of respiratory illness, it's particularly shocking. I'm really keen to hear people's ideas beyond just providing funding, which obviously is important, but how else? What else do we need to do to improve our housing stock and make our new built housing climate resilient? Because I'm very aware that in certain sectors, there's a resistance to actually taking action, private rented sector being one. So my third question is, what can the government do to persuade people that it is in our own interests to insulate our homes, to make our homes energy efficient? And for those people who are not in owner occupied, how can we incentivize landlords to make sure that they are doing the right thing by the people who live in their homes? And I have to say, I think there's a real difference here between private rented and social rented. Now, if everything's gone according to plan, at this point, I'm hoping that David, who's on this call somewhere, has got my polls waiting for you. Are you there? Yes. So here's the first one. If you could please, I want to make this a bit more interactive than just me speaking into the screen. Could you please click on the following questions, your answers? First of all, and it's anonymous, your names will not show on the screen, I promise. Do you have any low or zero carbon heat or energy sources in your home? And I'm going to answer as well. The second question, do you have any wall or loft insulation in your home? And the third question, have you ever had your home assessed for climate change resilience or energy efficiency? And then this is something I'm really interested in. I'm asking people as I'm talking to residents in different places. If you answered no to any of the above, why not? And this is a multiple choice question because you might find that more than one applies. So I've got, I rent, my landlord refuses, or I rent and my landlord says they can't afford to, or I don't know enough. I wouldn't know how to get someone qualified. I can't afford it. I've never considered it. I've considered it, but don't think it's a priority. If you could just click on whichever you think applies to you, and again, I'm going to, and then click on submit at the bottom. Little poll there. And I think we should get the results of that poll. I think they miraculously appear. The reason I'm asking this is because I'm intrigued to explore. And of course, yes, Hal said it's question 4 has a different answer, i.e. it's complicated, and that's true. It may well be that the answers that I provided just don't work, and I get that. I've been trying to explore with people what is stopping every home from being climate resilient. And in, say, the private rented sector, there are obvious problems with yes, you are going to have to enter something in question 4 in order to submit. I'm really sorry. This is not a scientific survey. I promise not to use the results in any papers. If you just click something, that would be great. And my apologies, I didn't write it as a well-constructed academic survey. It just wants to get us thinking, what's stopping us? Is it because it's not our home? If it is our home, is it just because we've got other priorities? I have a final question in a moment, which is, it was also for my own research. I don't know, David, if you've managed to put those 4 pictures onto the final poll. I had a final question, which is 4 pictures, which I wanted to know if any of you knew which of the following is not a heat pump. And that may not have made it onto a poll, but it's an exercise that you can carry out on your own, is just thinking about, why don't we have heat pumps in our home? Those of us who don't, and I don't, I'll own up to that. Why haven't we made the switch from fossil fuel to heat pumps? Is it the price? Is it because we don't know how to do it? Is it because we wouldn't trust the person installing it because we don't know enough about the technology? That was where I wanted to take us towards the end. So I have 3 questions broadly, but I'm interested in any points, suggestions, or other questions that people have. Because I think that we've got a clear difference here. Under the last Labour government, when we had the world's first climate change targets, when we had investment in affordable housing, when we had commitments to decent home standards, to quality, we made a lot of progress, but there was still a lot to do. And of course, unfortunately, over the last 10 years, we've gone backwards in many of those areas of progress. So whatever Labour government comes in next, whether I'm Housing Secretary or not, there's going to be a big job of work to do to repair some of the damage to affordability, to the quality in the private rented sector, but also in huge chunks of the owner-occupied as well. And there's going to be an even bigger challenge with speeding up our progress towards a zero carbon country. Buildings cost us 18% of our country's carbon emissions, buildings in general, housing in particular, 14%. That's a big chunk of carbon emissions we're going to need to deal with if we want to get to net zero. But I think that for Labour, we've got some really good Labour arguments as to why that matters. You don't need to respond to the phrase green campaigning if you understand that your home is cold and damp and you would like it not to be. And I think those are good Labour arguments that are about quality and real affordability. So I think in the Climate Change Action Committee for Shadow Cabinet, we've been discussing how else to describe what we're trying to do in ways that resonate across all the constituencies that we want to win back, as well as those that we currently hold. So as I think Lisa Nandy said recently in Shadow Cabinet, it's got to resonate in Wigan. It can't just resonate in Bristol West. And that means talking about quality and jobs, and the jobs and training that are going to need to go into installing the funny heat pumps that I found pictures of when I went on the internet. So that's where I wanted to leave it, so that we have plenty of time for questions and suggestions. And I think, John, are you going to share that for us with the miracles of the internet? Good luck. Thank you. Oh, there's the answers to the polls. That's interesting. Sorry, John, before we go on to you chairing, yes, I wondered whether it would be like this, that quite a lot of us have got insulation, and then most of us don't have low carbon heat or energy sources. We've got good reasons, I think, very often for why that is the case. Have we ever had our home assessed? Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think that's a matter of knowing how to get your home assessed and who is reputable. Lots of different reasons. And I think, obviously, some people said, well, it's complicated, and it's more complicated than the multiple choice answer that I gave you. But I think there is a real issue in the private rented sector about how we use either stick or carrot. I'm in favour of quite a lot of stick and a modest amount of carrot, to make sure that the private rented sector landlords are providing homes that are well insulated. The not knowing where to get someone who's qualified, I think, you know, the honesty that people have put down here, it's 23%, whether you were just clicking on something to submit or you genuinely meant you've never considered it. I think that's important, because on a day-to-day level, as you walk around your house, is it the first thing you're thinking about? It's often not. It's, you know, whether or not you need your boiler servicing because we're coming into winter and you want it to work well. Is that an opportunity to spend £7,000 on a heat pump? Well, at the moment, probably not, because we're so worried about money and the coming recession. So it is a problem. But I think that it's time that we worked out good Labour arguments for why this needs to be integrated into every aspect of housing policy. So I make no apology for talking a lot about climate change, but obviously there's a lot more we could cover. So, John, back to you.
Thank you very much, Thangam. That was really thought-provoking, and I hope it's sort of set the grey cells going for everybody here this morning. I'm going to invite some questions in now. Just if you can either use the raise hand facility and I'll bring you in, or if you can't see that, use the chat and I'll try and call you in from that as well. If we can try and keep questions fairly succinct, just so I can bring in as many people as possible for this this section. So first up, I'm going to ask Jennifer Budden if she wants to put in a question. I think she raised this in advance of the of today's session. So Jennifer, would you like to raise your question?
Hello, John. Sorry,
Hi.
I've totally forgotten what it was. I was busy writing to you. So
you actually raised a question here around houses being retrofitted with insulation.
yes. Oh yes, that's right. Yes, we live in a mixed estate. I was just typing a thing because volume builders will only put in what they're required to do, and as the government changed the rules in 2016, of course they don't now bother, and we have gas. Our neighbour actually works for a company that deals with PV and solar thermal, and he said that one of the problems that they've found is insulation put into walls of existing houses sometimes actually forms a bridge, and so they get damp. I'm not certain whether this is because it wasn't put in properly, you know, that it was just sort of stuffed in like people do, or whether or not it's because there is actually a problem with old houses and you know, them needing air between the walls or air bricks, that sort of thing. So that was basically the issue.
I think thank you, Jennifer. I think there's probably a lot of people on this call who know a lot about this, but I think it raises for me the issue of quality control, and I think that's what puts a lot of people off actually taking the step to spend thousands of pounds on something and not knowing whether or not it's properly regulated. So this means that I think we need to come up with, over the next few years, ways of making sure that when people invest in those insulation schemes, that they can be assured that they are of good quality, that we've got a regulatory structure that provides that. But also, and this is what I think is so astonishing about the government, last week, the Chancellor, when he said, I can't protect everyone's jobs, I mean, first off, I thought, well, there's another half to that sentence, which is, but I'm going to try. But he didn't say that. And what he also could have said was, and so I'm going to come up with investment in the training schemes for the jobs of the future, which are about getting us to a low carbon economy. He could have said that and he didn't. Here's a really good opportunity actually to invest for people, young people, but also people of all ages who maybe have skills and interests that could be transferable, but will need training into those jobs of the future. So I think there's a lot we can do there to make sure there's a proper regulatory structure and addressing the workforce issues we have got to install sort of energy efficiency that we're going to need. Lots of people are raising great things on the chat, by the way, which I'm busy copying. I don't know who's saving the content of the call, but if whoever it is could save it at the end as well, that'd be great. I'm trying to copy and paste into a document. Thank you.
I've been going old school and trying to scribble it down in by hand.
Yeah,
John, could I come back just quickly on that?
Very quickly, if you could, because I've got some others to come, Jennifer.
We live in a new build. What we have found is that the volume builders care not a jot about quality. It's totally financialized. They go for the cheapest. and it's all about profit. I could go on about it, but I won't. And that is another issue that I think has to be factored into this, because otherwise good companies that do a good job won't necessarily be employed by those that are contracting them.
Yeah, and that's why the regulatory framework matters, and the enforcement, and not stripping out local authorities so that they don't have the planners that they used to have that are able to do the proper enforcement measures as well. You know, we need good regulations and good enforcement so that builders, big volume developers like the ones you're talking about, Jennifer, they may be unhappy about it, but if they're made to do it, then they're made to do it. And I think that's what makes the difference. I think we've seen a government that has gradually eroded so much of the progress over the last 10 years.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to Paul Martin next, please? Oh. Paul, we seem to have a bit of a problem with your sound there. You're very squeaky and high pitched. I'm not sure if you've been taking helium today or something, but no, it's can't. What I'll do, Paul, I'll bring you the next question and see if you can have a look at your sound settings, because we just can't hear anything at all, I'm afraid, other than a squeaky noise. Can I bring in Anne-Marie Cousins?
Good morning, everyone. It was me that was getting you all to say good morning and talking about singing. I was reading some of the chat messages there. I'm a local councillor myself in one of the London authorities. I won't say which if anyone doesn't know who I am, so that it's quite clear I am expressing my own opinions. Jennifer touched on what I wanted to ask, which is about the cost. Council contracts is actually, I agree the work is done cheaply, but I think the contracts are quite expensive. And it's one of the problems that I have. I was quite surprised at the number of housing stock, current housing stock, that is damp, has mold, and it's possibly something to do with the cold bridging. But the relative number, it is quite a few. Then obviously there's whatever is happening in the private sector. I know this poll refers to our own properties, but in terms of the council housing stock, I always believe in sorting out your own before you start looking across the fence. I think it would be just great to have some more information about what can be done about those, and why on earth are these preferred contractors so expensive. It's almost as if to say, in these financial times where the councils are struggling, that they have no choice but to accept very expensive, and I would say suspect quality contracts. Thank you.
I mean, thanks for raising that, Anne-Marie. And it's really, really useful information about what a problem that is. And I think particularly as we go into council elections next year, it's going to be really important for Labour councillors to be able to show what they are able to do even under a Tory government on housing. So I'll be coming back to a lot of you who councillors across the country for some of the things that you want us to try and work on together, and that may be one of them, is how do we get the supply of good quality contractors to be more affordable for scratch local councils. But there does have to be good quality. It cost can't be at the expense of quality, and vice versa, of course.
Yes, that is a key word. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to try Paul again. Paul.
Hello, can you hear me better now?
That's perfect, Paul.
Right, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I live in a 20-year-old house with a 14-year-old boiler, and I had it serviced last week. And the engineer said they'd do me a new one for £2,000. I have a couple of friends who've worked for decades as professional housing people who live in the middle of Kent, and they are the only, absolutely only people I know with a heat pump. And that's because they have no gas supply, and they have a big area of ground around them, and there's all the stuff you need to put pipes in the ground or whatever it is you do. I do not know anyone who is offering to install a heat pump in an ordinary townhouse, and definitely not in a flat. So where are all these promises about getting rid of gas boilers, relatively modern gas boilers? I don't believe it.
I'm not quite sure what you mean, Paul. I'm not the housing secretary. I'm saying that the government is making it difficult.
Oh, no, I don't mean you. I'm saying that you see these official announcements that this is going to be phased out by 2025. Not a hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the point. The point that I was trying rather poorly, obviously, to make was that this needs a Labour government that actually understands some of the disincentives that there are, like supply, lack of workforce, lack of financial incentive, but also regulatory push factors as well. There is a government that keeps making promises and then just doesn't follow up on them, or quite often just fails to follow up on them, and is undoing a lot of the good work that was started under the last Labour government. So I absolutely agree with you, Paul. There's a real market failure, and the thing is, in a market mixed economy, is we are a social democracy. If there was a Labour government, we could be doing things to change the way the markets operate. As it is, I think you're absolutely right, because while I was searching for pictures of heat pumps, I was searching for suppliers, and I came across exactly what you're saying. In the middle of Bristol, yes, I could get someone to install me a heat pump, but I wouldn't know whether it was any good. That's the other issue, is even if I could, how would I know? And it's not a small expense. It's, it wouldn't be cheap. So I completely get what you're saying, and I think that's a good challenge for me to be challenging the government on, is where's the delivery on this?
Okay, can I bring in Robert Sale next, please?
Oh, thanks very much. I've just realised I've got to go for match for a minute. Yes, so much. This is the first time I've been to one of these things. Very interesting. On insulation, I think one of the things is the expense of doing it properly, as has been made clear. And I think we need to be, often the schemes are concentrating on the low-hanging fruit, and you get some charity in and they give you a bit of the loft insulation and a fluffy letterbox and all the rest of it. But as somebody mentioned, the issue of coal bridging, very important. One of the main things that needs to be done with housing, and particularly in areas where there's a lot of street-based accommodation with solid brick walls, is solid wall insulation. And probably the most effective way of doing that is externally clad. Now, let's not get all panicky about the word cladding. You can do that without killing people if you do it properly. Stuart Hodkinson's got a lot of information about that Labour should take into account when deciding its policy. We need a standard sort of terraced or semi-house to be solid wall insulated, costs about 17 to 20,000. There are places, I think Scotland is one, Ireland is another, where that kind of insulation is part of a grant scheme, because that is actually going to do more, A, for climate change, and B, for keeping warm, than what some people sometimes refer to as the green bling. You see the solar panel put on the uninsulated flat roof. Oh, look at me. And I think we've got to focus our policies on that, and the funding has got to be there to do that. And as far as gas boilers are concerned, we must remember that the big issue to do with all this is fuel poverty. And at the moment, it is actually unlawful to take out a gas boiler and put in electric heating system under the building regulations, because it is actually more climate negative to use electric heating or electrical appliances funded by that primary energy source than it is to use gas. And it's also prohibitively expensive. So I remember going once, there was some activist in Park Lane or Mayfair or somewhere that was saying, get rid of all the gas heating systems and put in electric ones. No, not at the moment, not while electrical energy is generated in the way that it is, and not if you're going to expect people in poor rented housing, whether that be social housing or private rented housing, to be able to afford to keep warm.
Thank you, Robert. And with so much of the contributions on this call, my response is, there's my trusty pen, down here's my trusty notebook, and I've just written down what you said. And I'm hoping that if you've got more that you want to suggest to me, that do get in touch. And the same goes for everybody. I receive a lot of really great suggestions from Labour Housing Group members and supporters, and I'm really grateful to you. There's a lot to do over the next few years.
Okay, Jeff Beacon.
Here I am.
Hi, Jeff.
A few quick questions. Embodied carbon is enormous in bricks and mortar. It's much lower in wood. we can build very cheap by automation what effectively are wooden prefabs, but can be made to look like quote ordinary homes. If we cut the planning gain out of the system, we could have building land for about 500 quid a plot. So put a wooden prefab on it, which would be low embodied carbon and cheap. You could get away with a start home for 20 grand. Now, why isn't this sort of thing possible? And two other quick bits. One is cars, according to the House of Commons Select Committee, mass car ownership is incompatible with low carbon living. And why do we have to heat 200 cubic meters of house to keep 2 meters of person warm? Should we be looking at warming furniture, not keeping our houses quite so warm?
All really good points. Thank you, Jeff. I mean, the Committee on Climate Change, their report on housing, which is really good recommended reading for anyone who hasn't, points out exactly what you said about the fact that wood is much more carbon emissions friendly than bricks and mortar, but it also has some reputational issues to deal with as well. The thing about modular and pre-built housing, I think there's an emotional reluctance to cope with the word prefabs. I think for a lot of people that immediately sets off the recoil of that must mean awful. And I think one of the things that I've seen certainly is the amount of very, very high quality housing that can be built off-site. And then that's often very good for putting into those small spaces, not small as in unfairly small, but spaces that wouldn't warrant a big development, that wouldn't make a big development cost effective, but can use up spaces in towns and cities. So I think we need a mixture of those things. And I think also you mentioned land, which is something we could talk about at great length, I think, on this call. There's a whole load of things that we need to do in relation to land and land value.
Okay, Jane Brigginshaw.
I'm just going to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Great to have this conversation. I think I'm speaking later at one of the workshops about this broader sort of climate change, green travel, creating propaganda units for all this in the large scale developments we're doing. But my question was more around something, Thangam, that you touched on, which was this idea of making climate change resonate. We're sort of preaching to the converted here this morning, and it's great to be with people who are converted. But how do we do that? Is it about jobs, as you said? Is it with the young people? Is it about issues that really touch people? How do we make it not a sort of middle class issue, which is just about the converted? And I'm really interested in your views on that, because I'm an architect, so the technical stuff we can take ahead, but the wider political issues, I think that's worth really thinking about.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised this, Jane, because as I said, this is the subject of great and heated debate in the Climate Action Subcommittee. We had a whole meeting where people kept using the word green, and I said, look, I mean, Bristol West, green comes up a lot as a word, but actually even in Bristol West, that's why I started with that poll, there's a lot of people who think of themselves as environmentally aware, but actually haven't translated that into their own homes. And I am talking about owner-occupiers here, people who will focus on recycling but haven't dealt with the insulation problem. So I think there's a lot of, I think there's two things. One is the issue of class, which is the assumption that I think we all possibly carry with us, that climate change as an issue is a middle class luxury to care about. But actually the assumption then is that middle class people such as myself have done all the environmentally houses with our things with our house already, and I haven't. I'm be honest about it. My home is not environmentally climate resilient. I can be absolutely honest about that. I live in a flood zone, but you know, it was a flood. It's going to be a flood zone into the future. So there's a whole load of things there. But there's also the issue. I think if you're going to turn this into something that benefits more people, it's got to be about good jobs. And it's got to be about making your home warm, safe, secure, and affordable. And I think people who don't respond to talk about environmentally resilient housing do respond to, do you want your bills to be halved? do respond to, is your home cold and drafty in the winter? Would you like something done about that? Would you like some help with doing that? We then have to deal with the fact that the costs are more, the cost effectiveness is better when you can do an entire street. If you're only doing houses one at a time here and there, that makes it much more expensive. So I think we need the sort of schemes that we did actually see under a Labour government, where there were mass schemes in whole streets or whole estates. We need more of that, so that it becomes about an entire community having warm homes, rather than an entire community deciding that we're going to have an environmental climate action campaign. But I think you also mentioned the young, and that really struck me. I go into schools normally, in normal times, once a week I visit a school in my patch. When I ask children and young people anywhere in my patch what the biggest issue is of our times, they certainly until now used to say it's the environment. When I then say to them, how many of you want to go into building engineering and architecture in your own life? So I think we need to try and find a way of getting children and young people's environmental enthusiasm translated into the skills that we need. Because quite a lot of them would keep their hands up. I said, how many of you want to be environmental campaigners? Yeah, they all want to be environmental campaigners. So, well, that's actually not necessarily a job. It is for some people. But what we really need is people who know how to build homes that are climate resilient, net zero carbon, people who want to go into engineering, people who want to go into design and development with that set of values. So I think we need to translate some of the value stuff into skills, because we have a chronic skills shortage in a lot of these jobs, as you will know.
I think that's really good. Could I come back on one of the
please.
issues? Just, I mean, there's millions of things that spin off from what you're saying, and it's really, it's great that you're so engaged with it. I mean, one of the things that we've been working on a lot is the construction industry, and how difficult it is to support women, particularly those who might be interested in these engineering, and ethnic minorities. And it's a type of revolving door that they might have got a bit better about getting people in, and not a lot. But as soon as they get people in, all those less represented groups find themselves so uncomfortable that they go straight out the door again. Yeah. And there was lots of work on that under the Labour government, but that's all fallen by the wayside, and it's a big, big nut to crack. So I'd be really interested in, you know, what you're going to do about that as well.
I think it's a big nut to crack, but I also feel more hopeful about the mindset change stuff than the finance and regulation stuff, because finance and regulation I can't do anything about until we're in government. Mindset change, I think we can all on this call be doing things about that.
Absolutely.
So as Labour councillors, Labour MPs, when we go into schools, we can be helping to shift school opinion, and lots of us have access to education. It's difficult at the moment because of COVID, but there are ways of remaining engaged with the local schools. And I think that's something we don't need to wait 4 years for. We can start, because young people are so engaged and so knowledgeable about what the problem is. But I also get, especially I got this last year, and I ended up with a slight feeling of exasperation with some of the campaign strategies, which were that children I met were just despairing, and they'd be crying. They'd be telling me, you know, the world is going to boil by the end of this year. I said, well, A, that's not true, but B, what are we going to do about it? And translating that energy and passion into skills and ideas and commitment to going into the sorts of jobs that are going to help solve the problem. I think it's important also for children's mental health, because I really saw last year, with the awareness of the environment growing and the passion growing, that for a lot of young people, it was detrimental to their mental health because it turned them to despair. And that's got to be shifted into, so you could learn how to, you could be involved in designing the homes of the future. You could be involved in building the homes of the future. You could be involved in inventing an alternative to gas boilers that's really, really fuel efficient and really cost effective, and isn't an enormous box in a garden that you don't have, for instance. How I feel about heat pumps at the moment. You know, so I think we can all do that now. That can be something that we can commit to now, is helping our young people feel, and not just young, by the way. We've got an employment crisis ahead of us. Those of us who are involved in either councils or private companies that have got the potential to be training people into those new jobs, we need to be working that out now. We can't wait till we have a Labour government. You know, we're a race against time. So thank you for raising that, Jane. I'm going to come back and try and track you down for a longer conversation about that.
No, I'd love to. There was lots of stuff done under the Labour government as well. Yeah. We can pick up on that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
I feel very inspired by the last Labour government's climate action work and that housing standards. I think that when you think back to before that government, before decent homes standard, just think, what sort of behaviour was that we didn't have those sorts of basic building blocks of good housing, and how cross am I that over the last 10 years so many of them have been ripped away.
I'm conscious we're getting lots of debate and thoughts coming up on the chat as well here. So please, people can have a look at that as well, which is also, I think, stimulating some further debate. I'm going to bring in just a couple more colleagues, if I may. So can I bring in John Gray?
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm the housing lead in Newham, East London. What we're planning to do, and I know it's been done elsewhere, but I'd be interested if it's picked up, is a concept called airspace. We've got about 1,000 low-rise blocks in Newham, and the plan is to put an extra floor on the top. At the same time, we can retrofit with energy-efficient cladding and roofing. It just seems a total win-win. We get cheaper units from this than from new build. It's obviously climate change of importance. And also, it even sort of gets leaseholders off our backs, because we don't have to charge them for putting what in many cases they need new roofs anyway. So it seems a win-win. I know it's been done elsewhere in the country. Any good examples? I'd love to visit.
Well, John, I'd love to come and visit what you're doing there. So maybe we could put that on the list of places for you to come and visit. I'm trying to visit. I'll just share with the group. You will all appreciate, as Labour members, my priority is to visit unfortunately, the constituencies we don't hold as Labour, because I need to be trying to make these arguments in those places. But I'm also really keen to come and visit those of you who are doing fantastic work already in areas we do hold, both council and constituencies. So I'd love to, if we can try and arrange a time for me to have a proper chat with you, John, and arrange a visit, that would be brilliant.
More than welcome.
And I'd also just like to pick up on a question that Lee Cowan has posed in the chat around the Community Housing Fund. Lee, would you like to ask that question?
Oh, thank you, John. you caught me a bit unawares there. I've just been. I'm on the steering group. In fact, I'm not in the steering group. I'm on the board now. We just had an AGM for our community land trust, which we started up. It took about a year to get going. We have a meeting with the council actually next week. I'm not going because I want it to just be, because I'm a councillor and I want it just to be come from residents. But I'm the treasurer on it anyway. In terms of funding, I know we're waiting for some kind of announcement from the government about the Community Housing Fund, and those funds are absolutely vital for community land trusts. I just wanted to know where we are with that, and what kind of pressure Labour may be putting on that department to actually come up with an announcement to support community-led housing, because it's I think it's part of the solution, and I think many of us recognise that. But if the money isn't there, then yeah.
I mean, totally, Lee. I will follow that up. I've just put a note to myself here to just put that in a parliamentary question to Robert Jenrick, and a bit of prodding. And incidentally, that's a wider offer to everybody. Anytime that you cover such a lot of expertise on this book, anytime that you can spot that there's something that I haven't prodded the government about lately, feel free just to email me directly and say, could you ask a parliamentary question? I can put that in right now, Lee. Well, I will when we've done this book. So thank you for reminding me.
I look forward to watching that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks everybody for those questions. Thanks Thangam for taking us through some detailed answers there. We're just trying to finalise some of the arrangements for the workshops that are coming up next. So I'm going to adjust the running order slightly. We were scheduled to have a comfort break at 11:30. I'm going to suggest that if we break for 5 minutes now, and if you stay online, we will then reconvene and allocate everybody to their individual workshops. So if we can take sort of 5 now, get back together at 10:55, leave it running, so you're straight back online, and then we'll put everybody into workshops at that point. But thanks again, Thangam, and thank you everybody for a really good opening debate. Again, thanks to everybody who's spoken at those workshops and participated in the discussions. We will be sharing the notes and the feedback from both rounds of workshops after today's conference, so watch out for that. We're now moving to our final session of the conference, and I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined for this by our Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Anneliese Dodds, MP. She's been MP for Oxford East since 2017, and prior to that, of course, as a member of the European Parliament, and has been our Shadow Chancellor since April of this year. So really great to have you here today. Welcome to the LHG conference. I'm going to ask Anneliese to speak to us first. Then I'm going to hand over to Steve Hilditch, who many of you will know as the editor of the must-read Red Brick blog. And Steve's going to interview Anneliese in more detail on Labour's approach. We'll then open it up to some questions from the floor, and I'll try and bring in as many people as I can in the time that's left to us. If again, you can use the raise hands facility if you have that available to you on your Zoom. If not, please just put a note in the chat and I'll try and bring in as many people as I can. Please try and keep them short and succinct as well, and I'll endeavour to get as wide a range of questions in. So with no further ado, welcome Anneliese, and over to you.
Great. Well, thanks ever so much, John, and thanks to all of you. It's really, really good to be here, at least virtually, I suppose, this lunchtime, and to be with so many people who are absolutely passionate about housing. And obviously, we've seen over the last few weeks and months just how critical housing is to all other aspects of our lives. We've seen that through this coronavirus crisis, which has both revealed our housing crisis and, of course, exacerbated it as well. Now, some government interventions over the last few months have indicated a flickering acknowledgement from government of problems that we all know have existed for years. The fact that social security in normal times fails woefully in covering the costs of housing. The fact that too often control is almost entirely concentrated in the hands of landlords in the private rented sector, not in the hands of their tenants. And the necessity of getting what had been an ever increasing number of vulnerable people who were rough sleeping into safe accommodation and away from dangerous, unsafe and unhealthy streets. But as we all know, the Conservatives are already withdrawing what little support they did offer, leaving people to fend for themselves and reverting to a status quo that wasn't working for millions of people in our country. Now, I know that Thangam earlier has been talking with all of you very powerfully about what Labour's doing right now to put pressure on the government to change course. And I'd also urge government, as I know Thangam has been as well, to take action to support people with mortgages who are facing hard times. It's not enough for government just to point to the mortgage holiday and then wash its hands of those who are still struggling. The previous Labour government did better, far better, and the Conservatives have got to learn from them now and reduce the waiting time for support for mortgage interest payments so people can get the help they need quickly. Now, as well as providing support to those in housing need during this crisis, it is, of course, important we think about what comes next and the role that housing can play in securing a fair and just economic recovery. And I know there are a number of people who are taking part in this conference who have been doing exactly that and writing about that and urging that change that's so necessary. Thank you to all of you. Labour, of course, has long said that we do need to see many more homes built of all tenures, not least social and genuinely affordable housing. Doing so, we all know, delivers affordable homes for people to live in, and it creates jobs and boosts economic growth at a time when we urgently need it. Analysis suggests that for every £1 invested in affordable house building, a further £1.42 is generated in the wider economy. And of course, we also need to upgrade the existing housing stock. Retrofitting homes so that they're more energy efficient is essential for our net zero ambitions, as well as bringing down energy bills for people and providing work at a time where our economy is sadly so weak. Now, the government has partially acknowledged this, as people will be aware, with its Green Homes Grant scheme. But of course, that funding is just a third of what was promised. Even in the Conservative manifesto, the criteria for eligibility are too narrow and the timeframes too short for this to benefit as many people as needed. So the Conservatives have really got to increase their ambitions radically on retrofitting. And of course, we need to ensure that homes are of decent quality. I know that's a goal Thangam and many of you are passionate about. The wholesale ripping up of our planning system, combined with changes to permitted development, won't just be awful for those families who'll end up being condemned to extremely poor quality accommodation. It will also denude our high streets of the well-planned mix of homes and businesses that international evidence shows can lead to economically dynamic, happy and healthy communities. And of course, we've got to learn the lessons from Grenfell, where action has fallen woefully short of what's needed. Not only must there be far more robust action to ensure safe homes, as Thangam's argued time and again, and I know many people on this conference as well, but we're also still waiting for any positive moves to support social housing. Despite the fabled conversion, I'm sure we all remember that conversion, claimed conversion of the Conservatives to social housing. In fact, proposed planning policies, as we all know, are going to actually make it far harder to deliver social housing rather than easier. Now, while policies to get new, decent homes built and to improve the homes we already have can deliver wider economic benefits, they should always have at their heart that one clear principle that each home is a place where someone lives. Sadly, too often, that's become secondary to the idea that a house is effectively a unit of currency, where the sole purpose is to accrue ever more of that currency. And worse than that, the financialisation of housing has led to a building that should be someone's home being used as a means of avoiding tax or laundering the proceeds of crime. As Shadow Chancellor, this is an area I'm particularly concerned about. More than £90 billion is estimated to be laundered through the UK every year, inflating the price of houses for everybody and leaving luxury homes sitting empty while families on low incomes are crammed into tiny flats because it's all they can afford. The government itself has admitted our property market is, in their words, an attractive vehicle for criminal investments. The scale of this problem has been starkly revealed in recent months, first by the Russia report and then the FinCEN files showing the extent of suspicious activity reports that have been revealed to US authorities. The number of these reports in the UK has more than doubled in the last 5 years. And it's 5 years since the UK government promised to crack down on this behaviour by putting in place a proper register of who really owns the overseas entities that buy and sell British homes. Since then, we've had nothing but delay and foot dragging. The government took over a year to respond to its own call for evidence. It dragged out scrutiny of that register of overseas entities bill, despite cross-party warnings that time was of the essence. And the bill wasn't included in last year's Queen's speech. And yet at the end of last year, Transparency International identified 421 UK properties, homes, worth over £5 billion bought with suspicious wealth. And that's likely to be just the tip of the iceberg, given 87,000 properties in England and Wales are owned by companies whose beneficial owners are unknown. But the government still sits on its hands. As things stand, the government will miss its own deadline of 2021, 6 years after David Cameron said there was no place for dirty money in Britain. That's simply not good enough. So today at this conference, I'm calling on the government to bring that bill forward before the end of the year and crack down on these practices once and for all. We're at a fork in the road. The Conservatives could choose to focus their energies on ensuring people in this country have affordable, decent homes to live in. They could finally set up that register of overseas entities to flush out the criminals using our homes as dodgy bank accounts. In doing so, they could secure a quicker, fairer and more sustainable economic recovery from the crisis. Or they could choose to leave things as they are. Too few houses available to be homes, with prices driven up by those who use property to hide illicit wealth. I urge the Conservatives to finally make the right call, and I urge them to act to make sure that we deliver houses as homes and heed all the calls from this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Anneliese. I'm going to hand over now to Steve.
Thanks, John, and welcome to our LHG conference, and thanks in particular for your opening comments about Grenfell, which was very welcome to know that the Labour front bench is certainly not forgetting Grenfell like so many people want to, and your fascinating announcement in relation to money laundering, which I even read about in The Guardian this morning. I wonder how. What I'd like to do is, I mean, housing policy has been made in the Treasury all too often in the last 40 or 50 years of my experience. And so it's great to be able to have a bit of dialogue with the person that holds the brief. I wanted to ask a general point about housing and the economy first, which is that house price inflation has been absolutely enormous, huge for, I don't know, 40, 50 years now, and has driven what we now experience as the affordability crisis, not just in home ownership, but also in private renting, and now knocking on into social renting. I wondered if you thought that achieving house price stability should be a key economic objective.
Thanks very much indeed, Steve. And I would say as well, thanks for all of your work and your blog as well, and all your campaigning on housing. I mean, it's very clear to me that actually, when we look at bank lending in particular, we've got to an increasingly unsustainable position. We've seen over the last 30 to 40 years, as I'm sure people will be aware, much more extensive growth in lending to purchase assets, particularly homes, of course, and far less proportional investment, especially in SMEs. And that's something that has gone on kind of under the radar for a long time, but which is, I would argue, very, very problematic for the future of our country. I think we're in a difficult situation now where so many people's economic health is tied to the value of their home because of the fact that we don't have that stability around pensions in particular. You know, we've really ended up in a topsy-turvy situation where housing so often is a form of investment rather than that home that people need. So into the future, I think we really do need to deal with that. I don't think there are any quick fixes around this. As you'd anticipate, I talk a lot to Thangam around this. We've got to deal with that affordability issue. That's the most critical thing. I suppose I feel that very keenly myself, representing Oxford East, which is one of the constituencies that has, you know, the highest ratio of house cost to average earnings. But of course, this is an issue right across the country as well in terms of affordability of the kind of quality of homes that people want to be moving into. And actually, many of the measures that government has introduced have just continued to push up that cost. They've not dealt with the fundamental problem, which is that lack of adequate supply. So I think you've put your finger on something very important there, Steve, that will need to be dealt with. But as we do that, as I said, we've got to recognise the fact that for a lot of people, their financial security is dependent on the value of their home or the homes that they own. So that there's no silver bullet here, I don't think.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. I'm looking specifically at affordable housing, which you mentioned. One of the problems for affordable housing is that it competes with all other forms of public spending. And yet investment is the thing we most want. And in housing, investment creates a permanent income stream. So eventually it pays for itself. In other countries, they exclude housing investment from the headline definition of public borrowing. I wonder, I mean, it's an argument that's gone on in the Labour Party over many years. And I wondered if you would be in favour of making a change which would liberate councils and liberate the public sector to get on and build.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, you're absolutely right that investment in housing does deliver over time, particularly investment, of course, in council housing, where it's not forced to be immediately sold off once it's been built. I mean, I'm talking to you from a council estate that I'm very proud to live on, and we all know the benefits that that delivers to tenants, and the fact that, you know, it's presented as something expensive. It's quite the opposite when it functions effectively. On those issues around the classification of borrowing, I think there's a lot of discussion that's going on about this internationally, actually. I mean, the big discussion at European Union level around how you do classify different forms of investment. Of course, we had, I'm sure people will remember the golden rule under Gordon Brown previously, trying to make sure we had a more mature approach to investment within fiscal rules. That wasn't just focused on housing, of course, that was looking at investment more broadly. I think we do need to get to a more sensible position around investment in housing, but I would say in other forms of infrastructure as well. We need to have a longer term budgeting horizon. In theory, we've got mechanisms to achieve that, like the so-called whole of government accounts. Without getting too techy about this, you know, it's meant to be bringing together all the different liabilities and forms of expenditure of government, but it's not actually used to consider how we could deal with some of the big long-term costs for government. And of course, you know, if we look at what's happened to housing benefit, and of course the housing benefit element within universal credit now, we can see how failing to deal with that housing supply issue and affordability issue has led to a need for increased expenditure as a proportion of overall social security into the future.
I think we'll come on to housing benefit in a minute, hopefully. But I think the issue is that we should see housing as a trading activity and not something that's artificially constrained by concerns about overall public borrowing. It makes money in the long term. Why don't we do it?
Well, I do think we should be obviously engaged in building now. I mean, we've had some suggestions from government. Obviously, they've changed the rules around, to an extent, council's ability to borrow around this. I would say that there needs to be a consideration of many additional changes. I don't think we may go on to talk about this. I know that obviously many people are concerned about this. I think suggesting the planning system is the only problem standing in the way of additional housing is absolute nonsense. There are many other reasons inhibiting that production of housing. And, you know, we know both in terms of new housing, but of course retrofitting, that particularly in a context where we're in a very deep recession, the evidence speaks for itself. You know, it's a very good way right across the country of supporting the creation of jobs and also having a positive stimulus impact as well.
Thank you. Talking about planning takes us on to a question that's been raised a couple of times today already, which is land. And land is one of the reasons why everything's gone so badly wrong in housing in the last 40 years. There's a lot of support in the party for some kind of land value tax, which would make it possible to, for example, abolish stamp duty or even abolish council tax. Is this a road you want to go down?
So we will obviously, as a party, be defining our policies on tax on the way to the general election in 2024. So I want everybody in this conference to be involved in that. I think it's really important that we have that really thorough discussion to set out our plans on taxation, to make sure that they're robust, to make sure that they really will deal with the problems that we face, as well as, of course, generating sufficient revenue. I mean, I think that the fiscal context is part of the issue, but I would also say that, for example, rules around viability are a big part of the problem as well when it comes to what occurs to different proposed developments, etc., where, you know, there really is an imbalance between the developer in particular and often local authorities. So yes, look forward to continuing this conversation.
I think the issue about a land value tax is that it's inevitably very complex. So I guess work would have to start fairly soon if we were to have a policy for the next election.
Well, as I said, as with all policies on taxation, we need to be working on them in the run up to the general election. I would say, though, right now, right at this moment, obviously we are facing that extremely deep recession, one which is the worst in the G7, one out of which it looks like we will have a slower recovery than many other nations. I think particularly the Conservatives right now have got to be focused on protecting the size of the tax base, trying to grow it, trying to stop people losing their jobs and stop businesses from cutting investment. So we do need to have that discussion about taxation within our party. We need to have that discussion about taxation in the country. But I would say right now, let's focus on not losing any more of that tax base before we talk precisely about how we're going to actually tax it. I think that would be what's necessary now, Steve.
I mean, what's interesting is that government support for housing generally is now huge. It's big, much bigger than it's ever been in the past, but it's very badly targeted. So Chartered Institute of Housing estimated last year that 80% of public support for housing now goes into supporting the private housing market. And a tiny amount really goes into producing genuinely affordable housing. I mean, this is something I think was discussed in the Labour Party over many years, is what they call the benefits to bricks argument, that we should be switching subsidy back into actual building. Is that something you would like to do?
Well, I think it is really important that we do, in the long run, do that. I don't think, however, that we can suggest there can be an immediate switch, because, of course, there are so many families who, if we did reduce their social security entitlement, would be in an even worse housing situation than they are right now. And of course, we've been arguing for the local housing allowance to go up to the average cost for the rental area. I mean, we're still just up to 30%. I mean, it's better than where we were. But, you know, I think it's really important that we don't lose that focus on the adequacy of social security right now. Of course, I want to see that change into the future. That means particularly focusing on the supply of genuinely affordable homes and social housing. Thangam's working really hard on that with her team. And, you know, I think we need to make sure that we're putting forward as much as possible the policies to deliver that. And as I said, I really think the current direction of policy, sadly, is going in the wrong direction. It's going to be a lot of the time where it does create new homes, creating unaffordable homes that people will need to have access to social security just to try to wash their face, but even then often still be pushed into debt for.
Okay. Can I ask a specific, because you mentioned new build. The manifesto last year committed us 250,000 new social rent homes, 100,000 to be built by councils. Is that still our policy?
Well, as I was talking about before, Steve, on tax, of course, we're working on all of our policies towards the next general election. I'm very clear that we need to have a very, very substantial increase in social housing. No question about that. We need to have a substantial increase in genuinely affordable housing. That should be delivered through the provision of homes, not through permitted development then being counted as completions, when we're actually talking a lot of the time about extremely poor quality flats, which I wouldn't a lot of the time classify as the kind of homes that I would want my family to live in. So why should I expect anybody else in our country to be living in that kind of a state? So we do need that radical step up in provision. Of course, we don't know what kind of a context we'll be in at the time of the next general election, but I'm certainly absolutely determined that we make sure we have a very, very substantial additional supply.
Okay, thank you. And one of the other things that came up during the last election was the need for rent restraint or rent controls in the private rented sector. Is that something that you would stick with, looking at it from your kind of economic brief?
Yeah, I mean, there have been interesting developments within London, where I know that the mayoral team have been looking at this question around whether there could be some kind of a system for trying to ensure, you know, greater affordability through that route. I think it's very important indeed, as I said in my speech, that we start to shift the dial towards tenants in the private rented sector, because they most definitely do not have enough control. We need to have longer tenancies, be moving towards that. I think, you know, some of the measures that we've been seeing that are meant to be encouraging that, I have my concerns about whether they will really deliver that in practice. I think that's critically important, giving tenants more security in that area. And certainly I'm looking very closely at developments in London around those issues, around the control of increases. As my understanding, they're looking at the control of increases in rents rather than the kind of absolute rental level to start off with. But yeah, looking at that with a lot of interest.
Okay, thanks. My last question, I'm looking at John because I've lost track of time. So hopefully he's in charge and will stop me when he needs to. But the last point I wanted to ask about was about leasehold tenure. I think there's a view in the party now that it's a feudal system that should be abolished. It doesn't serve the interests of residents. There are a lot of leaseholders who are being bankrupted at the moment because they have to foot the bill for fire safety, despite the fact they don't own their building, despite the fact that they have no say in the decisions that are made about it. What would you do to help them? And would you commit to a Labour government, if it still wasn't done by then, funding the remediation of all flats with unsafe cladding?
Yeah, I mean, I am very concerned about this situation. I'm concerned, by the way, about the situation for leaseholders with the changes around permitted development, but I'm also concerned around these issues of safety. I know it's something that our shadow housing team have been working on very carefully. And we think there needs to be a long-term solution to the remediation of buildings. It's very important. We don't think the Building Safety Fund is sufficient to ensure that all buildings, particularly tall buildings, obviously, actually will be made safe. So we've been calling on government to actually have a proper long-term solution to that. We think it's really, really important. And, you know, the kinds of tales that I've heard from leaseholders around being stuck in these kinds of situations are really heartbreaking. It really is not fair. It's clearly a situation where, you know, any suggestion that there's a kind of fair market around this are absolute nonsense. So it really does need to be dealt with for the future.
Okay. The last Labour government introduced Commonhold, which was a great idea, but has failed in implementation. Is that something you think we should revisit? Because this whole system needs to be taken out and replaced with something that works better for the people who live in these places.
I think we do need ultimately to somehow have a much fairer system. I think the fact that very often that's the only option for people in major developments just does seem very unfair indeed. Really is locking people into a situation where, you know, they're trapped in many, many different ways. And actually, often when they try and find out who the ultimate beneficiary from a lot of this is, you know, it's kind of hidden behind a whole range of different companies and ownership arrangements, which is desperately unfair. So I think in the long term, there really does need to be reform, but then there are also those kind of shorter term issues as well, where we really need to see government getting much more of a grip on this and not leaving those leaseholders to deal with all of this on their own.
Okay, look, I'm guessing that I've gone over my time and I'm going to get told off afterwards, and I'd better hand over to allow other people to get in. But thank you very much for engaging. I've been involved in Labour Housing Group since it started 40 years ago, and I think it's the longest conversation we've ever had with a Treasury frontbencher. So thank you for that. Thank you for engaging, and hopefully there's more we can do in the future. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's so good to see you all, genuinely. And thank you for all the work that you're doing to ensure that decent housing that's so much needed. So yeah, thanks very much.
John, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Anneliese. Just to echo everything Steve said there about, you know, how refreshing it is to be able to have this kind of in-depth discussion with the front bench team. So really grateful for you making time to join us today. I am afraid that because of the time that we're up against here, I'm not going to have a chance to pull in some of the excellent questions that have been posed in the chat. But what I suggest that we do is, if you're happy with this, if we share some of those questions with you outside of the meeting, and then feed back to everybody as part of the conference report back. Hope that's okay with everybody. Know that everybody's really keen to get involved in that further discussion. So
my apologies for overrunning. It's all my fault.
Steve, that's fine. I think you're articulating many of the questions that were coming up from members as well. So that's fine. Thank you both again. As I say, we'll be sharing the recording of the sessions with our keynote speakers online after today's event, and also the workshop notes, and we'll also pick up on some of those questions that have been raised as well. I'd just like to say again, thank you to our fantastic panel of speakers, both our keynote speakers and everybody who have had contributed in the workshops today. Also, thank you to Sheila and all my colleagues on the Labour Housing Group exec for doing all the organisation to make today's event the success that I think it's been, and also to our fellow socialist societies and Labour campaign organisations for supporting today's conference. And finally, a big shout out to David Shields, who's been our conference technician, dealing with all of the technical stuff and kept us going today. So thank you very much, David, as well. You've done a sterling job. Finally, just a few points from me. If you've not joined Labour Housing Group yet, why not? If you want to get involved, please join. You can join us online via our website, which is labourhousing.org. You can sign up as a member there. You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @LabourHousing, and there's been tweets going up all morning following the conference. And also, please do check out the Red Brick blog. That's redbrickblog.co.uk. Some brilliant articles on there, lots of different perspectives around the issues that we've been discussing today. I'd also just like you to look out for two forthcoming events that we're involved with. On the Tuesday, the 13th of October at 6 p.m, we're holding an online In Conversation event with Professor Danny Dorling about Fintopia, namely what can we learn from Finland, which is apparently the world's happiest country. In November, we're also hoping to be hosting an online screening of the film Push, which is a film by Leilani Farha, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing, who also spoke at our conference fringe meeting last week about how global finance is fueling the housing crisis. And there'll be some details to follow on that on the website, labourhousing.org. Finally, I know we've got some colleagues from London Labour Housing Group who will be holding their AGM after this session. That will be starting at 1:15, and you've been sent a link to join that session separate to this one. So thank you, everyone, for what I think has been an absolutely excellent conference. Look forward to carrying on these discussions in the coming months. I think it's got some very clear challenges that we need to meet and some real opportunities to drive forward a positive, radical Labour agenda on housing. Look forward to seeing all of you again very soon. Please stay safe, stay well, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Bye for now.